Hello everyone and welcome to The Reset. This week we're looking at the topic of fasting. As usual, we'll be having some conversations with some members from our congregations. So to jump right into it, this week I have with me Frauke and Andrew. And so, hello guys, welcome. And so jumping in, why is fasting important to you, Frauke?
I would say, biblically, there is really no two ways about it. We're supposed to fast. You know, Jesus talks about it, even though his disciples only dip into it once he's gone. But they're also culturally, with the Israelites, was a culture of fasting. You know, it was part of their yearly routine that the whole of the people, big and small, would be fasting and praying together. If you see people like Daniel, for example, you know, we know of him, but it was actually him and his mates together deciding we don't want to submit to what's common in culture. We want to set ourselves apart for God, which is what fasting is all about. And and so I think it's a given.
Yeah. And how about you, Andrew?
Well, very much the same, because Jesus, when he was talking about private prayer, he says, when you pray, which we all do, and he went on to say, when you fast.
Right.
And he also said that if you do it appropriately, your Father in heaven will reward you. So when my wife and I first realised this, we thought, well, we better get cracking. There was a book we had from Arthur Wallace on God's chosen fast, which was so helpful. And so we decided that we would fast one day a week, and we did it for several years as our children grew up and went through the teenage time. And I don't think we realised just how much of an impact it had on them until, for me, when my wife's funeral took place at St Aldates, my son, in his tribute, referred to the fact that we used to fast for them. And I thought, yeah, actually we did do that. And then can I think of a single good reason why I shouldn't start fasting for my 4 grandchildren?
Right.
And 8 years on, I still haven't found a good reason, so I'll carry on.
Yeah, amazing. So you've been fasting for a while then, Andrew. Could you share with us then a bit about the impact it has had on your life?
I think for me, I sort of go back to what happened in the early church at Antioch, where they had 5 really gifted spiritual leaders, prophets, and they wanted to know how to best use them. Now, we don't know whether they had a PCC meeting or not, but we do know that they had a time of prayer and fasting. And out of that, God called out 2 of those 5 people. Barnabas and Saul. They couldn't have possibly recognized the incredible impact that decision would make over the church, which we're benefiting from even now. And from the personal point of view, I can say that all my children and my grandchildren are in a good place with God. And let's face it, isn't that what every Christian parent wants for their children?
Any thoughts, Frauke? What about the impact of fasting in your life?
I personally would say the strongest is probably an alignment of my thinking and my praying to be more in line with what God is. And I think, you know, we're created as people with bodies. We've got a body, we've got a mind, we've got a soul, we've got our emotions. As we're aligning part of that with God, it's like our spirit sort of goes in agreement almost, and so it becomes embodied, which just can make prayer stronger, as worship can make prayer stronger. And on one personal level, prior to coming to the UK, I was in Christian ministry. I'd set some time aside to pray, and also did some fasting as part of that. And on the back of that period of time, doors opened up for me to come into the UK. I was leading a few summer camps with youngsters, and I had more conversions in those camps than I've ever seen before. So you can see both. It doesn't happen all the time, but there are occasions where it really makes a huge difference.
So you felt like you could hear more clearly, probably coming out of that time of fasting. That's really helpful. Okay, so we've established that there's some impacts of fasting first, but what about what that looks like for you in your own life, Andrew? And are there challenges?
There are challenges, but I think the fact that it's in my diary makes it much easier to concentrate. So on a Monday, I had breakfast, And then I go to work at the parish centre, and I have nothing to eat until about midday the following day. And that works out really well, because Tuesday morning is when I'm part of a sort of a 1 hour prayer group. And then I go for my extended prayer walk of the week, when I pray for the grandchildren and, of course, other people as well. And in fact, this Lent, for the very first time, I've taken on a second day every Friday when I don't have any liquids either. And that was actually, some really good things have come out of that.
Right.
There's an opportunity to serve God in a new sphere, which I hadn't thought of at all. So I'm exploring that. It's when you first start, you realise how wedded you are to food. I mean, considering the fact that the human body could cope, as Frauke was implying, for days on end without food. You never think so when you first start fasting. But actually, and you think about the food, if only this would finish, I can eat. But actually, I think we found very quickly, when it became regular, we could move it to a whole day without any real difficulty. So now, as I'm on my way home, I'm not necessarily thinking about, how I'm going to stuff my face or anything like that.
Right. So you build up some stamina over time.
But then you see, when I was rowing for the college, and we were getting ready for torpids in 8 weeks, I mean, every day we had to be disciplined. That was a given.
Yes.
And it was worth it. I mean, we actually got our oars, would you believe?
Amazing. So what about you, Frauke?
I definitely echo what you're saying about as you're building up routine, it's a bit like exercising a muscle.
Right.
So you start like with any kind of exercise, you start small. So, if you've never fasted food, drop a meal. And then, another thing I would say is, you've got it in your diary. If I don't decide to do it beforehand, it gets harder on the day.
Yeah, that's really
true. So commit to it, maybe tell someone else that you're doing it, so someone else can ask you whether you've actually done it. Exactly. Yeah. And then, then build up. I mean, there are different ways of fasting. If you're fasting longer, you might have to read up a little on what's helpful there.
Right.
But you could also, I would say, anything that becomes bigger than God in your life, anything that's potentially an idol, could be an area where we choose to fast from. Right. I've had times when I've been crashing in front of the telly every night, actually fasted from the telly. Another thing could be social media, if we try it for a day without or something.
That's really important, because there was a time in my life when I was actually pretty obsessed with computer games.
Right.
And so much so that I was actually thinking about them more than about Jesus, which I suppose is my definition of idolatry.
Right.
And so what happens now is that every Sunday, and every time I fast, and for the whole of Lent, I had no computer games whatsoever. And that's made a difference.
Right.
And that addiction is not going to come back.
Right.
And, let's be honest, who are we doing this for? We're doing it for God. And my experience has been, when I ask God for help, which I pretty much do still, if I do every day, because I'm not particularly good at fasting. It's like, Jesus, I really need you to help me.
Right.
And he then gives grace. That I sometimes find myself, just not even feeling hungry. So, just give it a go, I would say. And do it more than once. Because you might build up, like with that muscle, you might build up more strength as you go on.
Right. You were saying, Andrew.
Well, I think the fact that we take something really seriously, and there's something really important to us, and we want to convey that to God, I think God loves that. And I think he responds to that. That's the reward side.
Right.
He's a father.
Yeah. These are quite helpful suggestions and things I think we can all implement in our own walk as we try to grow in this discipline of fasting.
The irony of having the heaviest member of the leadership speaking on this subject is not lost on me, and nor, I'm sure, is it lost on you. John Wimber was the founder and father of the Vineyard Church and was very used of God to plant numerous churches all over the world and to bring renewal to the historic denominations, particularly here in the West. And I love the story that I read in his biography. On one occasion, he thought he needed to go and seek the Lord in prayer and fasting. And he told his wife, Carol, I'm off up to the mountains. I'm off up to the cabin. I may be weeks. I may be months. I'm seeking God. She said, okay, darling, gave him a kiss, and off he went. And then a few hours later, John burst into their house, arms full of boxes, and said, darling, I'm back, and I've got pizza. I've always been encouraged by that story. John Wimber, so wonderfully used by God, who heard from God and brought blessing from God to the church. He was someone who appreciated pizza. In Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, he said, when you fast, don't look miserable like the Pharisees, who fast to be seen and to gain approval of others. He said they've already received their reward. Just a little verse, but I think it's a really important one. There are three things in it that are significant for us. First, Jesus assumes we will fast. He said, when you fast, not if you fast. Jesus assumes that fasting will be built into our life. Secondly, Jesus says that there is a right and a wrong way to fast, and there is a right and a wrong motive in our fasting. He says, don't do it like the Pharisees, because they're doing it in order to be seen and approved by others. Fasting is a personal thing between us and God. And then the third thing in Jesus' statement on fasting is this, that there is a reward for fasting. He says the Pharisees who fast to be seen by others have received their reward, which is the approval of others. But he implies that there is a reward that comes from God, that reward being the approval of God. What is fasting? Well, one definition I read said this: it is to deprive oneself of all foods or some for a period for medical or religious reasons. Fasting is not slimming. Fasting is not going on a hunger strike. Fasting is not some sort of Gnostic asceticism, as if we need to negate or put the body and its needs and desires aside as if they have no value. Christian fasting is a physical practice that has a spiritual benefit. Fasting, if you like, is prayer made by the flesh. Prayer offered up by the body. Prayer that isn't just with thoughts and words, but it is a physical prayer. I often think of fasting as my body praying. Fasting is hunger for God. And fasting in the Bible is promoted, and it's seen as a normative spiritual practice that took place individually and corporately. We read that Moses fasted for 40 days and 40 nights before he received the law. David fasted when his son was sick as he sought God in prayer to have mercy. Israel fasted when she was mourning the death of the king and praying for a new one. Israel fasted when times were desperate and they were facing civil war and when they were facing invasion. Daniel the prophet fasted, confessing the sins of Israel. Nehemiah led the whole of Israel fasting in corporate mourning for previous sin. And when we get to the New Testament, we see that John the Baptist, the great forerunner who prepared the way for Jesus, spent his life fasting, a fasted life in the wilderness, just eating locusts and honey. And then we meet Anna, the prophetess, an 80-year-old woman who spent her days and nights in the temple courts, seeking God, worshipping, praying, and fasting. And when Jesus as a child is brought to his dedication, she sees. She is so attuned with God the Father, and the Spirit speaks to her and speaks through her, and she declares to everyone who this child is. And of course, our Lord Jesus fasted for 40 days in preparation for the start of his ministry. And there were other times when he didn't eat, and his disciples said, "Why aren't you eating?" He said, "I have food that you don't know about." They go, "What?" There is spiritual food that comes by giving up to seek God, literal, physical food. The church has historically built fasting into its calendar, into its spiritual life. Traditionally, the 40 days of Lent, as we prepare ourselves for the events of Holy Week, there is a giving up and a letting go and a self-discipline and a fasting, preparing ourselves, readying ourselves to hear and respond to Jesus. The early church, interestingly, fasted to give away to the poor. And in the 2nd century, the church father, Origen, said, "Let the poor be provided with food from the self-denial of the one who fasts." And I read one account of the historian Rahil, who said that in the 3rd century, over 1 million meals a year were given by Christians in Rome. And this wasn't surfeit food, that is surplus food, excess. They gave up their meals and they gave away their meals as part of their fasting. I think that's part of it. But most fasting doesn't have that altruism. Most fasting is about a personal pursuit of God in prayer. The spiritual guide and Christian philosopher Dallas Willard wrote this: "Fasting confirms our utter dependence on God by finding in him a source of sustenance beyond food." Fasting is, as I said, a physical prayer. The one who fasts prays twice. Fasting is a kind of loud knocking on heaven's door. Fasting is holding on to the Lord and saying, "I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me." Fasting isn't twisting God's arm. It's not bending his ear, but it is drawing near, and it's holding on, and it's aligning ourselves with him, and it is a spiritual communion. Fasting seeks God for repentance, seeks God for fresh anointing of his Spirit, for power to serve. It's seeking God for answers to prayer on intractable situations. It's seeking him for divine intervention. It's often seeking him when we need a divine revelation and guidance for the future. Fasting is getting serious in prayer with God. And fasting is also a key to self-examination. It kind of peels back the self, and it shows the layers of our soul before God. When we fast, we find that we take a good look at ourselves. I like what the French reformer John Calvin said. He said, "Fasting is not approved by God except for its end. It's not the thing, it's the goal." And he said it must be connected with something else, otherwise it's just a vanity. People, by private fastings, prepare themselves for the exercise of prayer, or mortify, subdue the demands of their flesh, or seek a remedy for some hidden vice. But there's a power in it. And fasting is joined to a goal of seeking God, of meeting God, of receiving from God, of dealing with issues that we have before God. And we can fast for ourselves, but we can also fast for others. People that we're praying for, people who've got troubles and have asked us to pray for them. On one occasion, the disciples were praying for someone, and there was a problem with this child, and the disciples' prayer didn't seem to be effective. And they said and Jesus came and Jesus ministered and the problem disappeared, the shadow dispelled and the child was healed. And they said, why couldn't our prayers work? And Jesus said, this sort can only be sorted through prayer and fasting. And sometimes when we've prayed and prayed and we haven't seen a breakthrough in an area, sometimes joining our prayers with fasting, a physical praying twice, as it were, with our body as well as our mind and our mouths, it brings a breakthrough. And then thirdly, what are we to fast? Fasting is associated with the forsaking of some form of consumption. And I think one can think of fasting in terms of not buying stuff for a month, or fasting TV, or fasting Google or Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, and that may be beneficial, but really I think that's about self-control and abstinence. In the Bible, fasting is associated with food and drink and sometimes even sexual relationships. So the Nazarites were a particular group. It was a particular vow that when they got serious with God, they gave up alcohol. And in fact, they didn't cut their hair. They gave up a kind of external form of show, display, or whatever. It was a sign between them and God. They're seeking God. The Israelites at times were called to consecrate themselves, and that meant that they were to give up strong drink and intimate relations. Daniel, we know, ate no meat or choice foods for 3 weeks. Sometimes it's called a Daniel fast. You continue eating, but you give up choice foods. You give up pud, you give up drink. Jesus fasted all food for 40 days, as did Moses. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:5 speaks of couples giving up physical intimacy just for a short while. Otherwise they get tempted by the other things. So he says physical intimacy so that they can pray. Fasting isn't fasting if it has no sense of cost. If it's easy, it's probably not fasting. There's got to be a bit of bite to our fasting, to our sacrifice. But biblically, there are no instructions. This is how you fast. Only Jesus' description, this is how not to fast, and then descriptions of how and what people fast. And I really want to encourage you in this discipline, this spiritual discipline of fasting, and begin to incorporate it in your spiritual life and your discipleship. And like all physical exercises, we build up muscle. So if it's never been part of your practice, then start small. Start by missing one meal, or start by cutting out, your choice things. And then maybe build up to missing out food for a day. And then after you're accustomed to that for maybe a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. And then as you grow and in this practice, God may lead you to give it up for a week or for longer. Be spiritual, fast, but be sensible. Don't overdo it. Lastly, what do we expect if we fast, if and when? Well, there are physical benefits if done sensibly. John Hopkins Medical Center have an article, and they say this: many things happen during intermittent fasting that can protect against chronic disease, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, age-related neurodegenerative disorders, inflammatory bowel disease, and some cancers. They also suggest that it is good for your memory, physical performance, and your tissue health. So there's actually an upside, not just on a spiritual level, but at a physical one, when we fast appropriately and sensibly. But Jesus, when he fasted, I've always found this verse amusing. It says, he didn't eat anything for 40 days, and afterwards he was hungry. And it says, and then the devil came and tempted him. And often when we fast, we're going to experience hunger. It's not as if fasting, suddenly things become awfully spiritual. We're not suddenly natural but supernatural, and we don't have a natural response. When we stop eating, our body says, hang on, something's not right. And my experience of fasting is, I'm just hungry. And but with Jesus, then the enemy came. And sometimes the enemy wants to undermine our pursuit of God in prayer and fasting, and will come and tempt us or trouble us. But it also goes on to say that Jesus then returned in the power of the Spirit. And I think in this spiritual discipline, as we pursue God, we come closer to God, we put aside things, we show God that we're serious. There comes a God draws near to us if we draw near to him. And his Spirit comes and rests upon us in a new way, in a more powerful way. But we can, as we fast, often feel quite sinful. Just as natural toxins come up and are shown, the longer we fast, the toxins come out on our tongue and in our skin and so on. Spiritually, we're shown things. Fasting shows us what we're like, and we can repent and seek God's forgiveness. My own experience of longer, lengthy fasts isn't fun. There's not any blissful state in it. One doesn't particularly feel blessed at the time. And whether we're missing a meal for 3 days or a week or 20 days or whatever it is, you can guarantee that the meal or the item you fast is the very thing you want. It's not some state of ecstasy. But we persevere because we're seeking God. I once kept a diary for a long fast that I did. And the first 7 days, I simply complained every day about how I was aching and hungry. And then the next week or two, I didn't write anything. I must have just been so miserable or exhausted. But afterwards, there's a sense that the Lord draws near. I hope you don't mind me sharing that. St. Augustine, the father of the church, writes this: fasting cleanses the soul, it raises the mind, it subjects the flesh to the spirit, it renders the heart humble and contrite, it dispels the clouds of desire, it quenches the fire of lust, it kindles the true light of chastity, and you enter again into yourself. As we fast, as we seek God in prayer, as we humble ourselves before him, the Lord does a work in our life and responds to our prayers, and we can expect some wonderful areas of breakthrough and blessing. But at the time, it's hard work. My favourite verse, which isn't directly about fasting, but I've always applied it to fasting, the wonderful words in the Magnificat, the Song of Mary. And whenever I think of fasting, I think of this verse. She says, God has satisfied the hungry with good things. God has satisfied the hungry with good things. Fasting is hunger for God. And when we hunger for God, God satisfies that hunger with good things.
Now I'm joined by Joe and Rahil, and we're going to be hearing a little bit from them about their experiences of fasting. So maybe, Joe, you could start by telling us, how did you begin fasting?
Sure. Well, I was brought up in a church community where fasting was quite normal for me. I saw the adults around me as a child fasting quite regularly and praying, and it just felt quite natural. As a teenager, I would fast from social media for a while, or maybe take part in fasts with my parents if I wanted to. And then as I went to university, a really emotional situation happened in my family, and I felt really called to fast weekly. So I would fast every Monday and pray for that situation, and just felt God really closely in that time.
Amazing. How about you, Rahil?
So I had to fast as a Hindu monk around 5 to 7 times a month. So that was 36 hours without food and water, which I initially started quite, passionately, but then my health got really bad, and I just couldn't fast, and I just started having such a difficult day if I was fasting. So when I came to the Lord, it was interesting. I didn't articulate this in my mind, but I thought, phew, I'm glad that's all gone, the fasting. And because, in India, when you're training as a monk, it's so hot. I literally was in tears. That's how dehydrated I was. And then 2-3 years in my walk with Jesus, a few people were praying for me over a period of months, and I kept getting these words that God's calling you to fast. And I thought, oh my goodness, But it was really fascinating because I really sensed God say, your health will really benefit if you just fast, And I did have some health issues in terms of my digestion. And I just felt this peace about it. And I started fasting every Monday, and I saw the benefits. So it was just an interesting contrast of, that was a very legal world I was in, a very rules and rituals world. And here I thought that wouldn't exist. And yet it did, but it was a much a kinder, more gentle way God wooed me into the fasting through the health route, and which then led to other benefits. But that's how I started fasting.
So following on from that, then what does it look like? What does fasting look like for you? And what does it do for you?
So I fast every Monday. So my last meal is Sunday evening. I have breakfast on Tuesday. And throughout Monday, I'll have tea, green tea or, ginger, lemon. And that's the nature of the fast.
Okay.
What does it do to me? By the evening, by 4 or 5 o'clock, I'm quite irritated. And so I noticed things in my heart that I wouldn't notice if I had access to food.
Wow.
And things crop up. When you're lonely, hungry, angry or tired, in my case, that's when things that are buried come to the surface. And so it just gives me this chance, not in that heavy, intense way, it just gives me this chance to just say to God, look, God, just keep an eye on that for me, can you?
Yeah.
Because these are minor cracks sometimes you find out in a fast that could be quite dangerous later on. They're very subtle, they're not like heavy and I don't sit down in this major confession kind of way and say, but I give it to God, and I just turn my heart and allow His presence to come into that area that isn't so healthy, or that thought that wasn't so good. And I just find that kind of freedom, when His glory, His rest comes into that space, I find a freedom, a newness. And so I find there's more space for Him to dwell. There's more space. So that's how I benefit.
Right.
So even though the fasting sounds grueling, actually I end up benefiting more.
Yeah, I love that. How about you, Jo?
That's so beautiful. I think for me, I've had like a bit of a journey with fasting. I think it can be quite a contentious subject. And while I was at university, I became ill with anorexia, with an eating disorder. And I decided to lay down fasting after some conversations with friends for a couple of years while I recovered from that. And I think, if people are hearing this conversation and maybe it's like throwing up some issues with eating or with feed, I would really encourage them to just have a conversation about that to start the conversation. But I have picked up fasting again in the last few years, and I found fasting in community has been really poignant and really important for me. So when you're traveling in discipleship with other Christians, when you're just walking life with people and something hard happens, it can be really powerful to say, let's fast together. Let's pray about this, because we believe in a God who hears our prayers, and we get to pray together. And I think we're really good at coming around a table to feast, and actually coming around a table and not feasting and praying and fasting for God to come and change the situation, to kind of share our heartfelt needs together, can be really, really powerful as well.
For sure. So for me, one of the things that I kind of struggle with sometimes in fasting is, how do I avoid being too legalistic about it? Any thoughts on that?
I've heard somebody talk about fasting before and say that there's like a vertical aspect of fasting and a horizontal aspect of fasting. So the vertical aspect of fasting is that when we're fasting, we're praying, we're worshipping, we're glorifying God. That's really the heart of what we're doing through our sacrifice. But also, let's not pretend that there's not all these horizontal worldly things as well. Like, we're hungry, and I often think a lot about food, funnily enough, in those days. And often there's like health benefits that we're thinking about as well, like the kind of whole juice cleanse thing. Maybe it will make us feel really good and feel more lively.
For sure.
But actually, those horizontal things, they're there. But the vertical stuff, the praying, the glorifying God, saying, this body is yours, is the most important thing. And I think for me to check myself when I'm fasting and saying, oh, am I glorifying God here, is really important.
That's key.
I said, no, like Joe was saying, you know, the posture of your heart is important whenever you're pursuing any spiritual discipline. You don't need to earn God's love or please him or work for him by doing a fast. And yet it is a discipline that sometimes in our culture is misconstrued with punishment.
Right.
It's not really punishment. When he calls you to fast, he wants to give you something. We're always benefiting in the relationship. And I find that when you strip away certain things for a day or so, you have more time to refine your focus on him. You know, there's not that many distractions. You're kind of stripped bare and you've got nothing to support you in terms of energy or whatever that might be. And so your ability to turn to him, seek his presence, seek his face, you know, seek his rest, it becomes more focused and refined. And I find that with anything in life, you know, any discipline you want to take, whether it's sports or music, there are disciplines, you know, there are certain banks that need to be in place so that the river can flow with the force. And spiritual disciplines are not legalistic unless you make them. If I don't do this, then God will. Then that's a different thing. But I just find that we benefit in this. You know, he gives us more freedom. He gives us a refined focus, and I don't think it's a legalistic thing.
Thank you so much. You have given me so much to think about, and I'm sure all of us will have lots of things to discuss in our small groups and think about in this coming week. So moving on to our practical tips for the week. Pick one day in the upcoming week to fast one meal. And what we can do is use the time that we would spend preparing our meals and eating to spend time praying and listening to God and just hearing what he might have to say to us. And perhaps over time, we can build up from that and maybe fast for a whole 24-hour period. Alternatively, we could fast from maybe our electronic devices for one evening this week. And in a similar way, use that time to really seek God and just hear what he might be saying for us during this fast. So thank you for joining us, everyone. And do join us next week for our final session in the Reset series when we'll be looking at witnessing.